Welcome to the Lost Signals discusses philosophy, narrative, and the mechanics of criticism. In this show, we analyze the greatest minds of narratology, both classic and current. Enjoy. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Lost Signals discusses philosophy and narrative. I'm Jonathan Ian Manser, here with Scott Thurlow.
And I'm Maid of Reference.
And Stephen Ramosi.
Hello.
Yes. And today we are discussing perhaps one of my favorite philosophers, Gottlob Frege, and particularly about how fictional characters and fictionalized versions of real characters can be interpreted through Frege's most famous work in German, apologize for the butchering, Sinn und Bedeutung, sense and reference. So, do you guys have any initial thoughts before we begin?
Nothing specific, but we discussed this precast, like, broadly, yeah, this is the thing you're studying, and you said to us, like, this is the work for me, like, and I can see why, for sure. But, I mean, it's sort of, we'll get into it, but my initial impression was it's somewhat classically, if you will, in quotes, philosophical work, like where he's delving into like all these machinations, I guess I'll call them, of how language works. But that's something I'm interested in for sure. And he's sort of like, of course, trying to arrive at a conclusion, a supposition, and then he sort of uses various other suppositions to prove why suppositions do not work, and so forth. And yeah, so it was interesting overall, and we'll delve into it. But that's pretty much. I just wanted to sort of throw out like what he covers and what we're going to cover with it. But my impression was I fairly enjoyed it as well. I thought it was a pretty good read. Yeah, it's a little dense at times, but I sort of mostly agreed with what he was trying to get at. So, and we'll talk about why in a sec.
It's absolutely dense, but it also delves into this interesting mechanic of language that I really liked as I was reading through it. It's a lot of examples of kind of how this works, like how the sense of things kind of works. And, it all kind of boils down to the first thing that he says in the essay, which is A equals A, also A equals B, but A equals A and A equals B don't mean the same thing. And the way that he kind of goes through that and talks it out, are you going to tell me that I'm wrong?
No, well, yes. No,
of course.
But in a way that I think that A equals B is more informative than A equals A. Even
it's richer. He uses the term
tautology.
Right.
A equals B is, and this is the whole premise of his work, is providing you with like new information where A equals A doesn't.
Right.
And but they are, in a sense, if you want to go to the referent, and they're both equal in the sense that they're referring to the same
core thing. Just one's sort of more robust. And
I think kind of his idea is that like A equals A is saying the exact same thing twice, and A equals B is saying the same thing in two different ways, and that can be taken in a lot of different ways when it comes to language.
That's what I got out of it too.
And that's
at that part.
And that's like kind of a fascinating topic to me, right? Is like yes. In the long run, both of those mathematical statements say the same thing, right? That A and A are equal, and A and B are equal. Therefore, all A's and all B's are equal. But there is a lot of interesting things that happen in the margins of those two.
It's a nuance and subtlety to it. Yeah,
that's why I was saying that you weren't wrong with what you're saying. I just think that there's very much like Frege, and he's a hero of mine, particularly because of what he created analytical philosophy in a lot of ways, although some people might disagree with me on that. But
fight them.
He certainly contributed to it.
Bertrand Russell was greatly inspired by him, Wittgenstein through Russell. I mean, I studied actually, this particular article in 3 separate classes when I was in college.
Sure.
So, but what I really want to get into is kind of the meat of what he goes on to give examples of for the majority of this work, is the idea of reference, sense, and the idea of an object. And the idea is the subjective view you have of an object.
It's almost like the impression of it that each person has, that each individual has it. At least that's how I sort of took it.
So let's give like his example of the telescope. We all 3 of us sit in this chair. The referent we're using in that discussion of the comfort level of this chair, the referent is the reference. Yes. What we're referring to. The sense is the comfort level. That's what we're describing. But our unique subjective impression upon what the comfort is. I find it comfortable. You find it comfortable. Steve-O, being the contrarian he is, finds it the worst chair he's ever sat in. Although we're still all discussing the same concept.
Sure, yeah, that's what I was going to say. Sense. But also, Steve-O has a different chair that probably isn't as objectively as comfortable as the one we have. Well, I'm just kidding.
But I was saying that if we all sat in this one particular chair, that makes it the same referent. And that our 2 levels of what we consider comfortable could be very different as well.
Sure.
But that's the idea of it. Which I think is a nice summation of how he views sense, reference, and ideas. Which brings me to, I think, the topic that I want to discuss at hand. Which is, he brings up Odysseus in this. Mm-hmm. That Odysseus has a sense, but he does not have a referent. I think Frege is wrong about this.
Well, I agree to an extent that I disagree with his sort of definition, like his label, when he uses that example. But I think of it this way, I guess. I'll propose this. It's something I jotted down. That maybe at the time he was writing, this is really hard to describe out, but that in quotes seemed more true to him. But I think perhaps, like, being that we largely cover pop culture, and as pop culture itself and pop culture evolved together, then that there is more, you're more valid and legitimate nowadays to use Odysseus or name any fictional character you want to, like, I don't know, Charles Xavier or something like that, right? Certainly that has a reference to an extent. I think that's sort of obviously true beyond the way that he was using it originally.
Well, I just wanted to throw in, well, first of all, please ignore all of my sneezing. My allergies have been kicking my ass this week. Secondly,
he's allergic to sense.
Reference.
I would like to hear, because I haven't heard this full argument from you yet, Ian. We didn't do this precast or anything. So, like, why do you say that Odysseus has a referent and is not just a sense?
I'm going to move away from Odysseus to, I think, a pop culture thing we can all agree upon.
Sure. Is it Charles Xavier?
No.
Oh, okay.
I just randomly
The dude abides. The dude does not abide. At the time following the events of the mistaken belief that Bunny Lebowski had been kidnapped by nihilists, the dude abided.
He was abiding.
I hope everyone's done their homework and watched The Big Lebowski before listening to this.
Are any of those true or false statements?
Well, I think maybe it's a trick question. Maybe try sort of getting at that. Like, they can be, depending on the context, of course.
Well, I provided a very specific context.
I'm not sure. Well, that's the thing. I'm not sure if the truth is the important thing in, like, analyzing what these statements are all about. Like, anyone who's seen The Big Lebowski has a referent for what the dude is, right?
No, they don't. Not according to
right. That's sort of what his argument.
They have a sense of what the dude is.
I'm kind of arguing your point, though. Yeah. Is like anyone who has seen The Big Lebowski kind of has a referent for who that person is. It's not like he needed to actually exist to be a person in the culture, and
Yeah, I see what you mean.
There
But
might.
that's what he's saying.
I think Scott, you might have mentioned that like maybe it's more true now than it used to be, but like I don't even.
I
think
take
that's the
that
case.
position, yes.
I don't even know if that's the case because like there's always been stories about people that everybody knew, right? Like if you know that person inside and out and they don't exist, I don't know. Maybe I'm mistaking what the referent actually is supposed to embody. You know, like it's supposed to say.
All right, from what I gather, it reminds me almost of a platonic ideal, if you will, but I not quite near there.
It's the
But I think
closest
that's
thing
a
you can get
good
to,
metaphor, perhaps. But this glass of wine that I'm holding right now exists. And perhaps that's the closest I can get in language to making a claim about an object.
Solid object.
A solid object. The dude does not exist.
To further probably your point, Ian.
Well, that's more towards Frege's point, though.
But to further your point, I think that any fictional character has no discernible distinction from any person that has actually existed that you have never met. I think that anyone that you have never actually met in your life,
That's interesting.
personally met, is basically a fictional character, right? You've only heard stories about them.
I actually have a really good example of that. Socrates.
Right.
He could theoretically
And that's the
be
second. That's the second-hand thing. Right?
A construct of Plato. Probably not, because I believe there are secondary sources evoking him. But
in theory,
I don't have
possibly,
any direct proof that he. So yeah, to that point, I have as much belief in a existing person I've never met as I did to a person who died a very, very long time ago.
Right.
sure.
But I still have a referent to them theoretically.
Well, theoretically, you should have that same referent, right, to any fictional character. It's you've only been told stories about this person. That's the
crux.
That's
of when it
the
starts
that's the
running.
connection that you have to them.
All right, but here's another example. Then I'll take Zeus is the god of fire.
He's been known to be.
It's a false statement. A Pegasus is
that's
rat
true. He has not been known
that
to be.
swims. Is also a false statement. Yet none of that, according to, I think in
his eyes,
in that
the references aren't really there.
That thus it can't be judged as true or not.
Well, I want to.
The only answer you can give is the Pegasus does not exist.
Yeah, right. I wanted to bring up because you mentioned first, Evo, and you mentioned just there, that one of the things he gets at is to assign any sort of like value. That what the value he doesn't assign is the truth value of a given statement that has both a sense and a reference, or first a sense, like sort of like a hierarchy, right? Mm-hmm. So if it lacks one, then it lacks like either the truth value is false or it's just moot because we can't discuss a Pegasus because it's again, quote quotes, actually exists. But I also I agree with you guys, sort of against him on that and that sort of angle about it.
In that same sense, right, Frege exists just as much as the dude, right? Like I've only heard stories of his actual existence. I had never met the person.
Ironically, he's falling victim to his own philosophy.
Exactly. But so think about that. He died hundreds of years before me. There's all kinds
Frege?
of
not hundreds of years.
100 years before I was 60 years before I was born.
Yes.
Whatever. He died long before I was born. Mm-hmm. Regardless, he has the same connection to me as any fictional character, really, that
I get
that
it.
I have grown to understand.
Even less connection than some fictional characters.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Certainly. I know more about many fictional characters than I do about Frege. And the fact that he, right, actually existed is something that I have to take on faith because I've never actually gone and taken the journey to meet him because I was not alive at the same time.
Now, what's interesting is I'm going to bring this from Frege himself. I don't believe he brings up this point. Is that perhaps when you're dealing with fictional characters, you're dealing with instead of saying the Pegasus is a horse that has wings, it's really it's a shortening of me saying I believe that the Pegasus, and
Right.
then the referent moves from the Pegasus to my own thought.
So, yeah, he does make that distinction in
But
certain
I don't
examples.
know if he does that, bringing it to fictional characters.
Like I said, in certain examples, yes.
Does he do it bringing it to non-fictional characters where you could say, I believe that, like, you should be saying, I believe that Frege held this claim to be true, but really what it is you say Frege held this claim to be true, according to him, right?
Yeah, I'm trying to find that passage.
You say Frege held this claim to be true, when in actuality, I'm just taking that on secondhand knowledge that the translation of what he wrote is correct, right? Like there's so much that goes into our understanding of what is actually true and what is not, and there's so much meddling that goes on around that, and knowing people the way that I think we all know people, it's difficult to think that something didn't get a little bit lost in the translation, right?
Sure.
I personally believe that Frege was a person that existed, but I have no way, literally zero way of proving that. Right?
It's fortuitous, I suppose you mentioned that, because I do have a line highlighted here that pertains to that in his article, where he writes, "This arises from an imperfection of language, from which even," I have this part underlined, "from which even the symbolic language of mathematical analysis is not altogether free."
Right.
So of course, like, there's always some ambiguity, or like some sort of, perhaps you want to say, like, deterioration of quote unquote the truth value of a given fact.
Yeah, I have one more point to make.
Okay.
To throw this in even a more interesting.
Right.
Please
hit me.
I'm before this. I'm right now suggesting that the mere belief or the mere creation of a fictional character, in a sense, gives a referential point. To
Automatically
anyone
is a reference.
So if I say Harry Potter was what was his Stephen? What was his house?
Gryffindor, yeah.
Gryffindor. That's a true statement. Like.
Within the confines of context.
yeah.
Sure, I mean, I'm agreeing to that.
To all extents and purposes.
Yeah.
Insofar as, like, Gryffindor and Harry Potter never existed, theoretically, right? Like,
yeah, but if
in the same way you could say that...
theoretically,
In the same way you could say that Frege never existed theoretically, because by some philosophies, the only thing that exists is the present moment, right?
Sure, but I'm saying, like, I'm agreeing with you guys and disagreeing with Frege on this point as well.
Anyway, I'm sorry.
I went on
because I think because I think, like, that is true. Like, sure, if you set up, like, I don't know how to say it, like, a fictional construct, but define those constructs by a consistent set of rules, then you can reference them, and they will be reference unto themselves.
Yeah.
Now, he brings up Christopher Columbus.
He does, strangely
in this
enough.
work, which is one of my favorite historical figures to poke fun at, because he was a monster.
He was a real piece of shit, yep.
Wasn't that cool, man?
So Christopher Columbus existed.
So we think.
I have a fiction about Christopher Columbus, and I have real stories about Christopher Columbus, both referring to, in a way, a sense, difference. Actually, in a sense, the same sense of, like, describing, like, this is his personality, this is his intentions going into, but with completely different truth values there, but competing ones where one person might say, this story is true, the other one might say, this story is true. Does the fictionalization of a real individual create two objects, in a sense, that can be referenced?
Perhaps infinitely branching objects. I think he actually talks about this in the paper. I don't have it in front of me. But he does
touches
say,
on it, but doesn't, like,
he does say
that
something
part.
about that, where it's like every person has their own interpretation of, and I'm obviously paraphrasing, but, like, every person has their own interpretation of, if something is a sense of a thing, which he says sense about 1,000 times. I honestly have no sense of the word sense anymore, but, like, if someone has a sense of a thing, another person has a different sense of that thing.
They'll be subjective, is what he's saying.
And those are not necessarily, neither one of those are necessarily and he
Are those ideas?
he
that
does
he's
kind
talking
of try
about
to avoid the terms true and false in this, which I approve, Frege. Good job, like not saying true or false, because obviously none of these things are true and false. But like he says, like those are neither one is less important than the other. They're just different, right? And like I think that's kind of the answer to the Columbus question. We'll say is like, yes, everybody has their own different sense of what Columbus was. But the idea is that his referent is a person that existed. I don't know. I think it's kind of flawed at its base.
But here's the thing: it's because the sense is Columbus was a good person and Columbus was a bad person are different ideas of the same sense. Which you're describing the sense.
They're two different senses.
No, they're not. They're describing the same sense in the sense that this is the way we're talking about something. I have a sense of like Columbus was a handsome guy. Christopher Columbus was an ugly guy.
Sure.
Like the sense we're describing him is his attractiveness level, but we have different ideas of what that sense leads. Like it's the subjective idea I have of the sense of the referent object. So it's
so what? So they're not two different senses. They're not. Are they two different references? Is that what you're saying?
I think this is where it comes, because here's the thing: is if you are like this is, they could be the same sense, such as Christopher Columbus was a beneficial explorer who traveled, discovered America. To Christopher Columbus is a genocidal maniac who never discovered America.
Yeah, the correct one, the second one. Yeah,
those could be different ideas of the same sense, of the same. But if it's an intentional fiction that's developed to create an alternate version of Christopher Columbus with a unique, I think that you could theoretically have two. It's no longer the same reference. It's the reference to the true Christopher Columbus, and the reference to the fictional Christopher Columbus.
Well, I have two.
And I know I just went Frege on that theory.
Sort of. You have to die. Well, let me jump in there while you deal with your afflictions.
I have several maladies.
Just a couple of things,
Just
like,
one, really.
broadly. So, like, to answer your original question, sort of a cop-out, but I think it somewhat also fits, is that maybe, like, depending on the situation, like, that you could have that two references and so forth. But it's interesting that you, like, the last thing you said, like, if you have a fictionalized version of a actual existing object and or person, like, that's also a sort of a tricky, slippery slope. Because, like, who decides, at what point where is it become quote-unquote fictionalized versus, like, the quote-unquote truth of a shared reference, if you will?
So I don't know. Like, maybe I'm a little bit not confused, but like maybe I'm
losing all your senses.
So I feel like the reference of the person, as Frege describes it, is supposed to be like what is contained in the name, right? Like I guess that's the best way for me to say it. It's if I say Ian, everybody knows who I mean by Ian. Even though everybody has a different sense of who you are, everybody knows what I mean by Ian. They have their own sense, but when I say Ian, it's just like how everybody might see a different color green, but when I say green, they know the reference, but the sense is different, perhaps.
Well, to your point, that's why I said earlier that I think maybe this is not true. According to Frege would disagree with me on this, but I think that the only sentence you can say actually without appealing to a sense is Stephen exists or Stephen does not exist.
Sure, I mean those that's sort of the ultimate like truth value, like 0 or 1. Because it really is or is not, but
that's Stephen or not Stephen,
right?
And that's really one of the simplest logical
propositions you could have,
right? And kind of what I took out of this was that like Frege had you could assign truth values, I guess, to reference it. Maybe I just read it wrong. I'm not even sure. Now I've thrown everything in.
He's got lost in references.
The only thing you assign truth values to really is references, right? Like this person exists or doesn't exist, but you can't assign truth values to senses because everyone has a different sense of whatever is whatever
being
you're talking
discussed,
about.
Yeah.
Or we could all be wrong on this.
I think-
I'm leaving that.
I was
going
gonna
to.
I think we're probably all wrong. Frege is just on a different level. He's like
yeah, very well
fucking
could be.
some demigod throwing down knowledge to everybody,
Maybe.
and we're like, oh, what the fuck?
That might be what he thought he
fuck,
was.
man.
So here's the other thing: is as I said, he might disagree with me saying that Stephen or not Stephen is attached to the reference, but Stephen has red hair is a statement about your looks that I'm making that can have a truth value.
An interesting.
I think that his thing saying that Harry Potter has blonde hair would be a nonsensical statement because Harry Potter
Because
does not
it's
exist.
like I said, he
Yes, that's and I realize now that we were supposed to be talking about this the entire time, but like, yes, you're right. There are like referential things that you can say about people that. So like, interesting that you say that, right? Like, so as I just described, reference and sense, right? Reference are is the thing that you can identify a person by. Sense is the thing that everybody has about
of that person or thing.
a person or whatever. And I don't think there's anybody in the world that will logically say and in good, in good faith say that Harry Potter has blonde hair, right?
Except if a Harry Potter exists that we're not referencing that actually exists in the real world.
That's
That
true.
does have blonde hair.
There could be a person
So don't
named
go
Harry Potter who has
judging.
blonde hair.
Well, he brings up
Everyone's
judgments real
wrong.
quickly too. but-
Actually, Harry Potter who has blonde hair, please watch our video and comment about.
Tell Frege how wrong he is
we
if you
are.
exist. Now, I just want to bring up like one minor thing that you reminded me of when you were mentioning it. Like he does like the color, the sense of the color green or whatever else you want to put there. Like to me, I thought it was funny because I personally invested in the subject of the problem of consciousness. But he had something like the joke I wrote down was, "It's not my bag, like not my focus here, man." Like, he's like he like acknowledges it that it's a thing. He's like, but what I'm trying to figure out is basically like the referential angle, like to
Yeah.
fictional, like again, constructs. I just thought it was funny, but not like to go back to what you just said. I think that's certainly what I got out of what he's arguing for. But I think I'm on your guys' side, specifically you as well. In general, that certainly you can have the dude didn't abide. Like, yeah, he did. Like, even though that he might say it's a nonsensical statement or non-referential one, at least.
Yes.
If you saw that movie, you know that the dude abided.
He did nothing but abide, really. But no, like, and
He
I
only
think
abided.
you could have that example, and to many things we just said. Harry Potter's a really good one, like the blonde hair thing. Like, yeah, it might stand, but as we understand it as a, I don't know, again, collective pop cultural property, then you can make perfectly valid references and, if not truth value statements, at least things that are close to that about them.
Completely agree. Frege, nice try. You son of a bitch.
Better luck next time on that point. But like the rest of it was perfectly fine. A lot of it's like mechanically breaking down like examples, sort of as you said, like basically like we updated a lot of the ones that he used.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think our describing Napoleon recognizing an attack on his right flank does not really echo in the modern day sensibilities.
Got to update them.
You
But
gotta,
I mean,
you gotta have a little history
but
for these.
again,
Well, actually, I just thought of this great. Napoleon is a great example of a fictionalized real individual because
sure.
the
Seems a lot taller now.
what,
No, I'm kidding.
but Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure
Yeah.
has a Napoleon. Not we can say there's a reference to, but the idea of him being a small person is quite incorrect.
it's
in
been sort of
history.
debunked more or
Yeah.
less.
Uh,
That's the impression that like was
actually, I think he was
perpetuated.
taller than average. Like for that, time.
He was
Yeah,
at
but
least
everybody
average.
was short, man.
But nonetheless, like so, the idea is that Napoleon was short, might be agreed upon with the majority of people,
Sure.
but be false to the reference.
But
to the
I would say that's a sense of him, right? Not a referent.
No, the reference to Napoleon.
Yeah.
Yeah, the sense of it.
The sense is short.
But there's this. But I feel that there's a. And this is going back to this. Now, this is the last thing I mentioned about it is that there's an image of the real Napoleon. The people who are like historians or interested in the thing, they have an image of him and are referencing. And then there's a pop culture kind of object that has developed over what
vision of him as well.
Different truths.
But I would say that the interesting thing about that is that while the historians perhaps are closer to what the real Napoleon was, they both have, like, both them and the pop culture version have the same level of separation from him. From the actual Napoleon, right?
Sure.
Like nobody alive now knew or saw or looked at Napoleon, and like, yes, they can oh my god,
sorry,
they can scientifically look at and go through what
sift through
the senses of him were from the day, sure, but we still have the same sense, and we don't have. I'm concerned that like historical figures don't have an actual referent. Anyone that you haven't met doesn't necessarily have an actual referent. They're all stories, right?
It's very interesting. I think Frege, if I agree with a lot of what he says there, he has a lot of consequences that might have been unintended.
Sure.
That weren't fully explored yet because he was still sort of like laying them out.
And I actually believe Russell, a couple of these I've read of Russell, tackle some of the questions that we're bringing up, which we might, if I can find them again.
Sure.
Yeah, we'll talk about Russell.
Because there was, like you said, there was a direct connection from Frege to Russell. They were contemporaries of each other, sort of mentors, student mentors.
Frege was earlier.
Like I said. He was, But either way.
All right, so any of you guys have final thoughts?
No, I mean, nothing specific. Like I said, like, there's an interesting read. Check it out. We can put up a link to it. We probably will. Yeah, it lays out, like you said, some interesting sort of grammatical games, but even more beyond that, and what it means when you refer to something. And I'm a big fan of reference in general, though not in the sense that he also uses it. And sense has been overused a lot, for sure.
Yes, let's talk about sense some more.
But no, like, it's a pretty solid read. And I know it's one of his like more studied works, as you said. So people out there might be studying it themselves now. And yeah, like it's just interesting to at least see what he had to parse out when he thought about these kinds of constructs, like I said. And
also check out the Begriffsschrift, which I just love saying.
The burger shift?
The
sounds like a German dive bar.
I'm terrible with my German.
It just sounds like a great bar.
Which I will check out. But anyway.
Get a pint.
Okay, well, I'm Jonathan Ian Manzer, and before you say I'm wrong, remember I'm a fictional character, and it doesn't matter. Here with Scott Thurlow.
And like I said, I think I might be no one. Good night.
Stephen Ramosi.
And just think about this. You have more reference to me than you do to Frege, so I'm better. Through video.
All right.
More senses.
You heard it here first.
More senses involved.
Steve-O's better than Frege. Good night.
That was so much more clever in my head.
Thank you for listening to The Lost Signals Discusses Philosophy, Narrative, and the Mechanics of Criticism. Editing and engineering by Jonathan Ian Manzer. Music by Christopher Morgan. Check us out on YouTube and iTunes for the shows, and on Facebook and Twitter for updates.